You know, when I was a kid, people were capable of holding enough of a nuanced view of gender that a girl having what might be considered traditionally masculine character traits would still be capable of thinking of herself as a girl. Would some people look at her somewhat askew for being a little bit more rough and tumble than other girls? Sure. But there was still enough room within the indistinct bounds of femininity that a girl would not have to choose between being a girl and being herself. Unfortunately, at some point, feminism introduced the concept of gender as being nothing more than a social construct, throwing the norms out of the window and telling us all that the roles and behaviors we traditionally associate with gender are just the individual manifestations of broader social expectations. You know, the girls play with Barbies while boys play with trucks sort of stuff. Essentially, the idea is that society brainwashes us to behave a certain way according to what happens to be between our legs. For the feminists, the concept was one part of the broader criticism of the patriarchy. Aspects of the idea seem intuitively true enough that it doesn't take too much nudging to get a reasonable and open-minded individual to give it more credence than it necessarily deserves. In other words, since the bounds of gender are actually so indistinct, it doesn't take too much of a logical leap to imagine that they don't exist at all. Add to this the fact that yes, many of the more superficial expressions of gender are almost entirely dependent on the cultural era in which they're expressed, and you can make a fairly strong case for the feminist view of gender. And that's the danger, of course. The idea of gender as a social construct is easy to rationalize, but it is itself a social construct. It's just that, unlike the one it is complaining about, it's an uncompromising construct that can only be applied through an aggressive restructuring of society and community. Its own rigidity makes it completely and exceptionally brittle in the face of any resistance. Which is why, of course, questions are met with hostility. Now, the feminists have never really been consistent with their own application of the idea of gender as a social construct, and this might sound like it should be an ideological weakness, but feminism essentially turned it into a strength by muddying conversational, narrative, and political waters such that its own inconsistency allowed it to avoid consistent criticism. Basically, much like your mum used to do, it used a combination of guilt and bullshit to confuse people into submissive silence. Enter transactivism. Using people with even more complicated personal stories as its battering ram, transactivism took advantage of this cultural narrative weakness created by feminism to completely dissolve the idea of gender. An intellectual and completely and obviously absurd inevitability of assuming that gender is nothing more than a social construct completely untethered from biology. It's a strange sort of cultural atomization that we see manifesting across the spectrum of what is contemporarily labeled social justice, but looks a lot more like social fascism. Like a cultural fifth column, so-called social justice warriors tear at the frayed fringes of society, further alienating the already discontent, forgotten, and downtrodden from the mainstream cultural core. In transactivism, we see the most obvious fascistic tendencies in the obsession with creating labels by which allies can be recognized and enemies fabricated, dehumanized, and scapegoated. Even as the LGBT acronym grows, so too does the desire by its most recent additions to alienate and attack traditional genders and their proponents. This is bigotry, plain and simple. I have no problem with challenging long-held tenets. The state of the world's end strongly implies we've been doing something wrong. But a line must be drawn before destroying cultural norms and abandoning the wisdom of tradition, while having nothing to replace them with but the bitter bigotry of perpetual revolution and intersectional infighting. In the case of trans activists, we should very seriously question the clear bigotry of some of their inflexible conceptions of traditional gender norms. The tomboy is just one casualty of their obsession with labeling and cataloging every permutation of human expression and coalescing the whole atomized bunch into one amorphous monolith of confused identity and malleable intent. Many cases of children undergoing surgery to support transition to a different sex will be looked back upon with the same distaste with which we view the lobotomies that marred early years of psychiatric treatment. Anyway, guys, if you're still listening, thank you so much for making it this far. Please hit the like button, please subscribe to the channel, and I will catch you later. Cheers.